My family's move to the lake house was a way to escape the world's chaos. During the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, my father had decided to relocate us to an old cabin in rural Massachusetts. The idea was simple. Out here, nestled between tall pines and the quiet lake, we would be safe from the outside world and its dangers. No people, no exposure. The cabin was older than I was by several decades, made of thick logs and built on creaky, uneven flooring. It was perched near the edge of a large lake, glimmering blue by day and pitch black by night. I used to find the place charming in my childhood. The walls whispered stories of their own, and the sprawling landscape around it held secrets. But now, with each creak and groan from the weathered wood, I felt a looming unease that was hard to shake. The first night, we settled in as a family. My younger siblings, Ben and Lily, were restless, not used to the quiet isolation after living so long in the city. To lift the mood, we set up a makeshift beer pong game outside, illuminated by the faint light spilling from the cabin's windows and a pair of flashlights we had haphazardly placed in the dirt. We were laughing, taking turns, when Ben froze mid-throw. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his gaze shifting toward the house. Lily and I exchanged glances, our smiles fading. "Hear what?" I asked. "It sounded like footsteps," Ben replied, eyes wide as he looked toward the cabin. Lily and I strained our ears, and there it was, a faint thumping from beneath the floorboards, like someone walking. The sound was subtle but unmistakable. Our laughter died. My father, sensing our unease, gestured for me to follow him. Together, we went inside, quietly stepping down into the basement, the ancient wood creaking underfoot. We searched every corner, casting the flashlight beam over stacked boxes and cobwebs, but the place was empty, filled only with stale, cold air. Returning to the main floor, we bolted the doors, double-checking the windows. My father assured us it was probably the house settling, an old structure creaking under its own weight. But none of us felt completely convinced. Later that evening, after an awkward silence, we headed inside. The wind had picked up, causing the tree branches to scrape against the cabin's walls, filling the night with unsettling sounds. I had just started to relax on the worn-out sofa when we heard it, a loud, frantic pounding on the sliding glass door. "Help! Please, let me in!" Startled, we turned to see a man outside, his face half-lit by our weak interior lights. His cheeks were flushed, his skin covered in what looked like dirt and maybe dried blood. He was pounding on the glass with enough force that it shook in its frame. His eyes, wild and pleading, darted from face to face, desperate for us to open the door. "Please," he begged. "I'm hurt. I need to come inside." My father approached the door cautiously. "Where are you hurt?" he asked, voice steady but firm. The man didn't answer directly. He kept repeating, "I need to get in. Please, you have to help me." His voice was strained, almost frantic, and he pressed his hands against the glass, leaving smudges. "Sir, I'll call an ambulance," my father said, still holding his ground. He raised his hand as if to dial 911, but the man's face twisted into something between anger and desperation. "No! Don't call anyone! Just let me in!" Alarmed, my father pulled the curtain across the glass door, shutting out the man's view of us. His pounding grew louder, more insistent, as though his fists would shatter the glass at any moment. My father motioned for us to go upstairs, urging us to lock our windows as we passed each room. Despite our growing fear, we eventually fell asleep, comforted by the belief that we'd done everything we could to secure ourselves. The hours crawled by, and I must have finally drifted off because the next thing I remember is the sound of shattering glass. I bolted upright, heart pounding. The dim glow of my phone's clock read 3:13 a.m. The cabin was silent for a moment, then the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the main floor. I grabbed my phone and texted my dad, heart in my throat. "There's someone in the house." Seconds later, a reply. "Hide. Closet. Now." Not daring to breathe, I slipped out of bed and into my small closet, pulling the door shut as gently as I could. My mind raced as I pressed my ear to the thin wood. I could hear footsteps moving slowly down the hallway outside my room. The door creaked open. Through the slats in the closet, I saw him, the man from outside. His face was calmer now, a strange, almost serene smile stretched across his features as he scanned my room. His eyes seemed to fix on the closet door, and he took a step closer, a low chuckle escaping his lips. "I know you're in there," he whispered. My heart felt like it would explode. Every instinct told me to stay hidden, but his words dug into my mind, planting a seed of terror that bloomed, threatening to consume me. I could feel his presence, hear his quiet breaths just inches away. A wave of adrenaline hit me. Without thinking, I burst out, shoving past him and sprinting down the hallway. I could hear his footsteps behind me, close enough that I felt his fingers graze my arm. Bursting into my parents' room, I slammed the door shut behind me. My father stood there, baseball bat in hand, his face twisted with fear and resolve. He held the door closed as the man's fists pounded against it, a frenzied assault that echoed through the cabin. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. Silence returned, thick and oppressive. We waited, breaths held, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, we heard the distant sound of sirens, and relief washed over us. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the man was gone. They searched the property, combing through every inch, but found no trace of him. No footprints, no broken branches outside, nothing to suggest he had ever been there. As dawn broke, they advised us to cover the shattered glass door with a trash bag for the time being, a makeshift solution until it could be repaired. Before they left, one of the officers turned to us, his expression grave. "Strange thing," he said. "There's been reports of people seeing someone similar around the lake area at night, but every time, they vanish before we can arrive." For weeks after, I couldn't sleep without checking every lock, every shadow, haunted by the image of that man's face, his strange smile, and the words that still echo in my mind. "I know you're in there." Moving to Manhattan was supposed to be the beginning of my fresh start. After years of saving, I finally found a tiny one-bedroom apartment nestled on the third floor of a pre-war building in the East Village. It was small, sure, but it had charm, a view of the park, and, most importantly, was miles away from my parents' house on Staten Island. I was ready to start my new life in the heart of the city. The one issue? My apartment was practically empty. I'd budgeted well for the move but had next to nothing left for furniture. And so, I did what anyone in my position would do. I turned to online resale apps like Letgo and OfferUp, hunting for cheap, decent pieces that could make my apartment feel more like home. Most of the stuff I found was either too far away or picked up by someone else before I even had a chance to make an offer. But then, one evening I got lucky. Scrolling through Letgo, I came across a beautiful dark wood cabinet, sturdy, clean lines, just a little worn around the edges, and going for an absolute steal. The seller, someone named Josh, had posted just a single photo, but it looked perfect. I messaged him immediately. He replied within minutes, saying the cabinet was still available. When I asked why it was priced so low, he said he was in a hurry to clear out some old furniture, and was just happy to get rid of it. The only catch? He wanted to meet later that night. Late for furniture, I thought to myself. But hey, it's New York, people are busy. So, without giving it much more thought, I agreed to meet him at 10:30 p.m. He suggested a spot near Central Park, a quiet little dead-end street I wasn't too familiar with. Still, it didn't seem that odd at the time. I figured he didn't want to bring a stranger to his apartment. I decided to leave a bit early. Around 10:15 p.m., I hopped on the subway, and as I got closer to the location, I felt that odd stillness you sometimes get late at night in the city, where the usual sounds are muffled and everything feels just a little bit off. The air was thick with fog, and the street lamps barely cut through it, casting a faint, eerie glow over everything. When I finally arrived, I pulled out my phone to let Josh know I was there. But just as I was about to type, I got a text from him. "You're early," That stopped me in my tracks. There was no way he could have seen me arrive. Visibility was poor with the fog, and I hadn't seen a single soul on the street. My skin prickled. I laughed it off, though, chalking it up to my nerves. "Yes, just a bit early," I replied, trying to keep it light. Almost immediately, he responded. "Come through the alley between the buildings. I'll meet you in the back." I looked around. An alley. Between buildings. This didn't sound like the easiest way to pick up a piece of furniture, and that unsettling feeling was gnawing at me again. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe he kept the cabinet in a shed or something out back. It was New York, after all, and people store things in strange places. So I walked over to the narrow gap between two old, looming apartment buildings. The fog seemed to thicken as I stepped into the darkness, and the alley was only dimly lit by a single flickering bulb near the end. My footsteps echoed off the damp walls, and as I got closer to the backyard, I caught a faint, unpleasant smell, a mixture of mildew and something metallic, maybe old rust. Finally, I reached the backyard. It was larger than I expected, with weeds pushing up through the cracked concrete and an old shed leaning precariously in the corner. I couldn't see anyone, though. I texted him again, feeling more uneasy by the second. "I'm here. In the backyard." A few moments passed. Then, another message appeared. "Come inside to get it. I'm in the shed." That was it. The red flags were flaring now. Everything in me screamed to turn back, but I tried to reason it out. Maybe he was just shy, or didn't want to meet out front. It could still be totally normal. I took a shaky breath and decided to follow my instincts. I typed a quick reply, my fingers trembling. "I think I'll pass. Thanks anyway." I turned on my heel, but as I moved toward the alley I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement, several dark shapes standing still but looming close to the wall, as if they were waiting. I couldn't make out any faces, just silhouettes. My heart thundered. There was no way I was sticking around to find out who or what they were. Without looking back, I broke into a sprint. I raced down the alley, my breath catching in my throat as I heard the sound of footsteps following, heavy, fast, and gaining. I didn't dare turn to see who or what was behind me. I just ran as hard as I could. When I reached the main street, I spotted the faint blue lights of a parked police car in the distance, and screamed for help. The officers saw me and jumped out, drawing their flashlights as I stumbled toward them, gasping and shaking. "Someone's following me!" There were people. They were waiting in the backyard. One of the officers nodded, signaling for his partner to check it out. They escorted me to their car, letting me catch my breath as they checked the alley and the backyard of the two buildings. They returned a few minutes later, looking puzzled. "Are you sure this was the spot?" one of them asked. "Positive," I replied. "I texted the guy. He told me to meet him here." He frowned and motioned for me to follow him back to the backyard, where he shined his flashlight around, illuminating every corner. The place was completely empty. No cabinet, no signs of life, nothing but that rickety old shed leaning against the far wall. The officers exchanged a look. "This place has been abandoned for years," one of them said quietly. "Nobody lives here." I showed them the texts, but when they tried to trace the number, it led nowhere. There was no sign of any person named Josh. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace. The police filed a report but said there was little they could do since technically, nothing had happened to me. As they drove me back to my apartment, one of them looked over at me, his expression grim. "You were lucky tonight," he said softly. "These sorts of things, they don't always end this well." I never heard from Josh again. The texts disappeared from my phone the next day, like they'd never existed in the first place. I tried to move on, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I still feel that prickle of unease. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm convinced that whatever waited for me in that backyard wasn't just a few strangers or some messed up prank. It felt like I had brushed up against something dark, something that lurks in the hidden corners of the city, waiting for someone just unlucky enough to stumble across it. And I'll never, ever go furniture shopping online again. One summer when I was about 13, my family drove down from Ohio to visit my uncle, Dave, who lived deep in the forests of Kentucky. It was an annual tradition, a peaceful getaway from the usual hustle and bustle. His place was charming in a rustic, eerie kind of way, set miles off any main road, nestled among towering trees. The house itself was old, maybe a century or more, with creaky floors and dim lighting that flickered now and then, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I always felt a bit on edge out there. Maybe it was the silence, the way it was almost too quiet, or perhaps the dense trees that stretched so far and high, blocking out most of the sunlight. But there was something else, too, a feeling that I was never really alone. One afternoon, I decided to take a solo walk through the forest, something I rarely did without my cousin Mark or my dad. But that day, the air felt fresh, and the thought of exploring felt exciting. I grabbed my flashlight, even though it was still light outside, and set off along a narrow path I'd discovered on a previous visit. The walk was serene at first. The forest was alive with the rustling of leaves, birds chirping, and the occasional crack of a branch. I wandered deeper, marveling at the sunlight filtering through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. But after about 20 minutes, that comforting silence faded. It was subtle at first, just a prickle at the back of my neck, but soon I felt it clear as day. I was being watched. I slowed my pace, heart thudding as I looked around, scanning the trees for anything out of place. The forest was silent now, even the birds had gone quiet. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the feeling grew stronger, like a weight pressing down on me. My stomach churned with a sickening unease. I turned back, telling myself it was just nerves, maybe even my imagination, but every few steps, I swore I heard a twig snap behind me. Walking faster than practically running, I didn't stop until I saw the clearing up ahead where my uncle's house stood. Bursting out of the trees, I sprinted up the porch steps and slammed the door shut behind me. Only then did I let myself breathe, forcing down the sense of dread that had followed me. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. My family had gone into town to pick up groceries, leaving me alone to my thoughts. I brushed off the strange feeling, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. After all, nothing had happened. It wasn't until evening, just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the trees, that I heard it, a sharp, distinct knock at the front door. I froze. My parents and uncle weren't due back for at least another hour, and they'd usually call if they were going to be late. The knock came again, louder this time, like whoever was out there wanted to make sure I heard it. Maybe they're back early, I muttered, walking towards the door. But just as I reached for the knob, a voice came from the other side, a man's voice, deep and unfamiliar. "Hey there," he said, his voice muffled through the door. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need a bit of help. My car broke down up the road." My hand froze on the doorknob. Something about his tone felt wrong. It was too calm, too measured. And there was no way he could have had a car nearby. We were miles from any major road. I'm not sure I can help you," I called back, my voice trembling slightly. "My dad's not here right now. He'll be back soon, though." Silence. Then, after a pause that stretched uncomfortably long, he spoke again, this time with a strange hint of amusement in his voice. "Oh, I saw him leave earlier. I know he's not here." My heart sank. How did he know that? Panic swelled in my chest as I slowly backed away from the door, my mind racing. The man knocked again, harder this time, and I heard another voice, another man, this one quieter, speaking in a low murmur that I couldn't quite make out. They were both out there. I forced myself to stay calm, my eyes darting around the room. I knew Uncle Dave kept a shotgun in his bedroom, an old hunting rifle he had used to scare off the occasional wild animal that wandered too close. Without another thought, I bolted to the back of the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Just as I reached the bedroom, I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy boot slamming against the front door. The men were trying to kick it down. Hands shaking, I found the shotgun leaning against the wall near the bed. I'd never used a gun before, but Uncle Dave had shown me how to load it. I fumbled with the shells, forcing them into place, all the while listening to the pounding at the door, each kick louder and more desperate. Then silence. The next sound was a creak, followed by hurried footsteps. They'd found an open window. Panic clawed at my throat as I raised the shotgun, bracing it against my shoulder just as Uncle Dave had shown me. The first man appeared in the doorway. He was tall and lean, dressed in a filthy, worn-out jacket with wild eyes that seemed to glint with a sick sort of pleasure. He took a step forward, hands raised slightly, a twisted smile spreading across his face. Now, he said, his voice calm, almost soothing, as though he were trying to comfort a frightened animal. No need for that, kid. We're just here to talk. I kept the gun trained on him, my finger hovering over the trigger. I didn't say a word, didn't move a muscle. Then, he took another step, and I saw his accomplice, a stocky man with greasy hair and a sneer that sent a chill down my spine. They exchanged a glance, and I knew, in that moment, they weren't going to leave willingly. With a surge of adrenaline, I steadied my aim and cocked the gun. The sound echoed through the room, and the taller man froze, his face twisting in frustration. He lifted his hands higher, backing up slowly, and I watched, breath held, as they both retreated out of the room, then down the hall. They didn't make it far before they broke into a sprint, disappearing out the front door and vanishing into the darkness of the forest. I stood there, gun still raised, until I heard the distant sound of a car approaching. My dad and uncle burst through the door minutes later, their faces etched with worry as I recounted what had happened. The police came, though they found no trace of the men by the time they arrived. They searched the surrounding woods, but all they found were a few cigarette butts and footprints leading off into the thick trees. After that night, my uncle installed deadbolts on every door and a security camera on the porch. I never took another walk alone in those woods again. I was about 7 years old at the time, and my parents had signed me up for this summer camp program. You know the type: arts and crafts, sports in the mornings, a snack break, then some reading or nature walk in the afternoons. At the time, it seemed exciting, a place to make new friends, play games, and stay out of my parents' hair while they worked during the day. One day, near the middle of the camp season, I remember running around in the playground after lunch. I was playing some make-believe game with 2 other kids, battling invisible monsters or something equally childish. It was a hot day, I remember that. I could feel sweat dripping down my neck, and my legs were sticky from running on the rough asphalt of the little play area we had. And that's when I noticed him. There was this man, sitting on one of the old wooden benches nearby, just outside the playground fence. I don't remember why I noticed him at first. Maybe it was his bright white shirt that stood out against the peeling paint of the old bench. Or maybe it was the way he seemed to be looking right at me, like he already knew me somehow. I hadn't seen him around camp before, so he was definitely new. "Hey kid," he called out to me, smiling like he was greeting an old friend. His voice was warm, friendly. Safe, even. I stopped and walked a little closer, just within earshot, but still on my side of the fence. "Hi," I replied, feeling a bit shy but curious. He looked to be older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair, round glasses, and a worn baseball cap pulled low over his head. "You're Jamie, right?" he asked, and I remember being startled that he knew my name. "Yeah," I answered slowly, unsure whether to feel special or creeped out. He smiled wider, showing a row of crooked teeth. "I'm Robbie. I'm a friend of your mom's. She asked me to come by because she's going to be a bit late today." The way he said it felt so natural, so convincing. At that age, I didn't question much, and there was no reason for me to doubt him. A grown-up knew my name, knew my mom. He had to be telling the truth, right? "Okay," I said, still a little hesitant but accepting it. Robbie glanced down at his watch and nodded. "You can keep playing," he said with a casual wave of his hand. "I'll wait for you over here until they call for you." And so, I went back to playing, occasionally glancing over at him, feeling a strange mix of pride that I had someone there waiting for me, like my own personal escort. But as the day wore on and afternoon activities started wrapping up, I felt a strange pit forming in my stomach. I could see him sitting there still, waiting, watching. Finally, the counselor came around, announcing pickup time. "Jamie, your ride's here," she called out, glancing over at Robbie and smiling politely as he approached. I remember she looked at me, her brows slightly furrowed. "You know him, right?" I didn't want to be rude or make it seem like I didn't trust him. After all, he was a friend of my mom's, wasn't he? So I nodded, and that seemed to be enough for her. She gave me a reassuring smile, assuming, I guess, that all was in order. With that, I walked over to him, and he took my hand. His grip felt oddly firm, almost too tight. He led me away from the group, past the other parents and kids, and toward the parking lot where an old blue sedan sat idling. I remember noticing how scratched up it was, with rust eating away at the edges, and the windows were too tinted for me to see inside. "Let's get you in the back seat," he muttered, more to himself than to me, pulling open the door and gently nudging me inside. I clambered into the car, my heart pounding a little faster now. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. When he closed the door, I tried to tug on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The child locks were on. I sat there, stiff as a board, as he walked around to the driver's side, got in, and started the car, pulling out of the lot without a word. That's when the fear started to really sink in. This wasn't how my mom or dad would drive. They'd ask me about my day, chat about what we'd have for dinner, maybe even put on some music. But Robbie said nothing, just stared straight ahead with this strange intensity, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. We sped through the streets faster than felt safe. I kept glancing out the back window, hoping to see someone following us, someone to signal that something was wrong. And then I did see someone. One of the counselors, Ms. Jensen, I think, was standing outside the camp building, pointing at our car with this frantic look on her face. She was yelling, and there was another staff member beside her, holding a phone up to her ear. I tried to sit up higher, to catch a better view, but Robbie noticed. "Sit down," he barked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror with this glare that shut me up immediately. I sank down, too scared to make another move, heart pounding like it was trying to break out of my chest. Then I heard it, the distant wail of a siren, growing louder with every second. Robbie swore under his breath, his face twisting into something ugly, something no longer friendly. He slammed his foot on the gas pedal, the car lurching forward with a speed that made my stomach twist. I clutched the seat, feeling the weight of the situation finally settling over me like a cold, dark shadow. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something terrible was happening. The sirens got closer, and I could see flashing lights reflecting off the side mirrors. Robbie glanced back, his face flushed with anger and frustration. He let out a low growl, muttering to himself as he took a sharp turn down a side street. But the police car followed, staying right on our tail. It wasn't long before another siren joined the first, and then another. Robbie kept driving faster, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel, his eyes wild. And then, finally, he pulled over, skidding to a stop. The police car stopped right behind us, red and blue lights flashing in a dizzying blur, bathing the car's interior in a surreal glow. I remember shrinking down in the seat, heart racing, as if I could somehow disappear into the upholstery. Robbie, his face a mask of panic and anger, looked at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes cold and calculating, assessing something that made my skin crawl. "Listen," he whispered, his voice now low and dangerous. "You don't say a word, all right? Not one. They're just going to talk to me for a second. Got it?" I was too terrified to respond, frozen in place as he got out of the car, slamming the door behind him. From the back seat, I watched as a tall police officer approached him, hand resting casually on his belt, his eyes sharp and unwavering. Another officer joined him, her hand on the radio clipped to her shoulder, watching Robbie closely as they exchanged words I couldn't hear. The next thing I knew, Robbie's demeanor shifted entirely. He was arguing, his voice rising with a desperation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. He gestured wildly toward the car, his face twisted in frustration as he pointed at me, and I could see the officers exchange a quick glance before the male officer stepped forward, signaling Robbie to calm down. I wanted to look away, to pretend none of this was happening, but I was glued to the scene unfolding outside the car, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. And then, the male officer moved closer, reaching out a firm hand to grip Robbie's shoulder. In an instant, Robbie spun around, his face contorted in rage, and shoved the officer back. That's when everything happened all at once. The female officer called out for backup, her voice urgent and calm all at once. The male officer had recovered his footing, and within seconds he'd drawn his handcuffs, snapping them around Robbie's wrists, as he pressed him up against the side of the car. I saw the male officer murmur something close to Robbie's ear before hauling him off to the back of their patrol car, Robbie struggling the whole way, his face now twisted in fury and fear. I sat there in stunned silence as the officers managed to secure him in the back seat of their patrol car. My body was still frozen, a dull numbness spreading through me, until another police officer, a woman I hadn't seen before, came up to my window and tapped on the glass, her expression soft, comforting, but still serious. She knelt down, her face at my level, and her voice was calm, soothing. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady. "Are you okay? You're safe now, all right?" I managed a tiny nod, though I could barely feel my own body. She reached over, opening the door gently and extending her hand to me. I hesitated, looking around, trying to spot a familiar face, anyone I knew. But when she reached in and held my hand, there was a warmth in her grip that made me feel like it was okay to leave. Once I was out of the car, she led me over to a safe spot on the sidewalk, where another officer had arrived and was talking into a radio, eyes flicking back and forth between Robbie and the scene around us. My eyes stayed glued to the police car where Robbie was being held, his face pressed against the glass as he stared back at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Minutes stretched on, and I felt every second drag by, each one thicker and heavier than the last. Just when I thought I couldn't take the silence anymore, I heard a voice, my mom's voice, calling my name, shaky and desperate. I turned, and there she was, her face pale and stricken as she ran toward me, her arms reaching out as she sobbed my name over and over. She dropped to her knees in front of me, pulling me into her arms so tightly I thought I might break, her shoulders shaking as she cried into my hair. I clung to her, feeling her warmth, her heartbeat, the familiar smell of her perfume, and finally let go, the weight of everything collapsing in on me as I cried too. After a while, when my tears had started to dry, I looked up and saw the officer who had pulled me out of the car explaining the situation to my mom. She was nodding along, her hand still holding mine, though I could tell by the way her lips trembled that she was barely holding it together. She kept glancing over at me, her eyes full of an unspoken fear that made my stomach twist. The police told us later that Robbie, or whatever his real name was, hadn't known my mom at all. He had no connection to her, to me, to anyone at the camp. He was just someone who'd been watching, lurking, learning enough about me to sound believable, waiting for the right moment to make his move. And I trusted him. The horror of it all hit me in waves over the next few days, the realization that I'd been so close to disappearing, to being taken, to maybe never seeing my mom or dad or anyone I loved ever again. I'd been working late again. It was the third night this week, and my brain felt like it was wrapped in fog as I drove down the empty streets. My only company on that lonely stretch of road was the faint hum of the radio and the occasional streetlight flickering overhead. It was well past midnight, and I should have just driven straight home, but my gas light had been glaring at me for the past 20 minutes. I knew I didn't have enough to make it. I groaned as I realized my only option, the old gas station on the edge of town. I'd heard enough stories about the place that I usually steered clear. They said it attracted all sorts, the kind of people you'd rather not meet in the dead of night. But what choice did I have? The next station was miles away, and I was running on fumes. As I pulled in, the flickering neon sign buzzed over the lot, casting an eerie, pale green glow. A chill ran through me as I glanced around. The place looked deserted, and I took a deep breath, telling myself I'd be in and out in under 5 minutes. Just enough to fill up, no eye contact, and get out of there. But that's when I saw him. A tall, gaunt man, his clothes tattered and face shadowed beneath a dirty baseball cap, was rummaging through a trash bin by the far corner of the lot. His figure was silhouetted by the dim light, making him look even taller and more skeletal. My skin prickled, and I felt an instinctual urge to turn around and leave, gas be damned. Yet, somehow, I couldn't look away. The man froze, his hands buried in the trash as he slowly raised his head. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I felt like he could see right through me, like he knew something I didn't. He tilted his head, a slow, eerie grin spreading across his face, and he whispered something, almost like he was talking to himself. "You know, a bag like this," he said, lifting a large, dark sack that hung limply over his shoulder, "could fit a body. They'd never catch you. Nobody's watching." My heart thumped wildly as I took an involuntary step back, fumbling for my keys. The air seemed to thicken, every sound suddenly amplified, my own shaky breaths, the wind rustling the leaves, the man's whispered mutterings as he dropped the sack and began to walk toward me. As I turned to get back into my car, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, another man, standing by the pump, watching. A surgical mask covered most of his face, but his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. He didn't move, just stood there, his body rigid, waiting. With trembling hands, I jammed the key into the ignition, barely breathing as the engine sputtered to life. I didn't dare look back as I tore out of the station, my heart pounding like it was about to burst out of my chest. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel, but I didn't slow down until the station was out of sight. The road ahead was dark and winding, stretching into the empty fields. Only once I was sure I was alone did I pull over, just to catch my breath. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, trying to calm down. What just happened? That man, the way he'd looked at me, the things he'd said, it all felt wrong. The image of his face, that twisted grin, flashed in my mind, and a shiver ran down my spine. And the other man, just standing there with that blank, emotionless stare behind his mask. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was all over. Maybe they were just drifters, people down on their luck, playing mind games to get a reaction. I'd gotten away, and that was all that mattered. With a deep breath, I started the car again and continued down the road, hoping to put as much distance as I could between myself and that place. But as I drove, something strange caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, I saw headlights, a single pair of faint, yellow lights far behind, weaving slowly along the road. At first, I thought it was just another car, but the longer I watched, the more unsettled I felt. The lights didn't seem to be moving at a normal speed. They were just hovering, like the driver was following, keeping just enough distance to stay in my line of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that it was just another driver, but a nagging feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I pressed down on the gas, speeding up a little to see if they'd follow. To my horror, the headlights did the same. They weren't close enough for me to see the car itself, just those two dim lights floating in the blackness behind me, like eyes in the dark. Trying to keep calm, I picked up my phone and dialed my best friend, Katie. She was a night owl and the only person I knew would be awake at this hour. "Hello?" Her voice was groggy but comforting. "Katie, it's me. I think I'm being followed." My voice trembled, and I forced myself to sound calmer than I felt. "Followed? Are you sure?" She sounded more awake now. "Yeah, I was just at that old gas station, the one off Route 17. Some guy there, he said something weird to me. And now there's a car behind me, just following at a distance. I don't know what to do." There was a pause. I could hear her shuffling around, probably getting out of bed. "Okay, listen to me," Katie said, her tone steady. "Do not go home. If they're really following you, you don't want them to know where you live. There's a 24-hour diner about 10 minutes from here, right? The one near the old post office?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, I know it. Drive there. I'll meet you. If they're still behind you, at least you'll be somewhere public." It was good advice, and it helped me feel a little braver. With a quick glance in the mirror, I saw the headlights were still there, keeping that same, unsettling distance. I swallowed hard, then told Katie I'd be there soon and hung up. Every minute felt like an eternity as I drove toward the diner. The road was pitch black, and the silence felt oppressive. My mind kept replaying what the man at the gas station had said. A bag like this could fit a body. The way he looked at me, like he was trying to gauge my reaction. My heart raced as I thought about it. What had been in that bag? Why did he say that? And why had that other man been standing there, just watching? Finally, the neon lights of the diner appeared up ahead, their warm glow cutting through the night. I breathed a sigh of relief as I turned into the parking lot, quickly scanning the lot for Katie's car. But she wasn't there yet. I pulled into a space near the entrance and watched as the headlights in my rearview mirror pulled into the lot behind me, lingering by the edge, almost like they were waiting. My hands were trembling as I locked my doors, keeping my eyes glued to those lights. The car didn't move. It just idled there, the engine a low rumble that felt ominous in the stillness. I felt trapped, caged, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, the driver's side door of the car opened. A tall figure stepped out, his face obscured by a hood. He took a few slow, deliberate steps toward me, his gaze fixed on my car. I could barely breathe. It was as though the air had turned to ice. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, when suddenly, a familiar pair of headlights pulled into the lot. Katie. She parked next to me, her expression shifting from concern to alarm as she noticed the man standing just a few feet away. Without hesitation, she got out and walked straight to my car, knocking on the window. I rolled it down just a crack enough to hear her. "Are you okay?" she asked, glancing nervously at the man, who had stopped moving and was just staring at us, unblinking. I don't know," I stammered. "He's been following me since the gas station." Katie's eyes narrowed, and she shot a glare at the man. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice loud and firm. "Can we help you with something?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, the same eerie way the first man had at the gas station, and then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his car. The headlights flared to life, and in moments he was gone, disappearing down the road as if he'd never been there. I sat there, frozen, my mind reeling. Katie climbed into the passenger seat, her face pale. "Let's go inside," she said softly, glancing around as though half expecting him to return. "You're safe now." But even as we walked into the diner and sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. The events of the night replayed in my mind, over and over, like a broken record. That man, that terrible, twisted grin, and the other one lurking in the shadows. It was a few days before I could sleep without looking over my shoulder, and weeks before I could shake the paranoia completely. But every once in a while, when I'm alone on the road at night, I still feel it, a pair of headlights trailing just out of reach, a dark figure lurking just at the edge of sight, waiting.